Okay, looks like we still have a few more people joining, but I think we'll go ahead and get started for today. So welcome everybody to this month's Modern Change Academy. My name is Colin O'Brien. I am one of the product managers that manages digital product release. So this particular month, we're going to be going over how digital product release, which is ServiceNow's modern release management solution, can help simplify and streamline your change management process. So with me, I'm also joined by Joe Offenberg. So let Joe say hello.
Hi, everybody. Joe Offenberg. Yeah, I'm an outbound product manager in our ITSM business unit, and I focus on change and release management. Nice to see so many people here today.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. And then we have a couple others that will be a part of the team. Balaji, one of the other inbound product managers. So if you see, one of us responding to questions, there's more than just Joe and I that will be helping answer. So we definitely have access to the chat today. I'd also recommend using the Q&A section just so that we can capture the questions, but we'll be monitoring both chat and Q&A for this webinar today. All right, so before we get started, just a housekeeping item. While the majority of what we're going to be going over today is based on the current versions of digital product release and change management, toward the end, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are coming that haven't been released yet, that we're still in planning, that we're still implementing. And so for those pieces, I'll explicitly call it out, but we just need to go over the safe harbor that we will have some forward-looking statements toward the end. And so don't make buying decisions off of that. And they're based on our best estimates of what we have for today. But again, that will be at the end, and I'll explicitly call it out when we transition from what Joe's showing, which is out, versus what is coming in future releases. So first, I want to start with what digital product release is and what it's trying to accomplish, like what this solution is geared toward. Because as we look at the change and release process, DPR is trying to be what I call a release process orchestrator. So what that means is that you would have your release process. How do you validate that something's ready? We want to make sure that we can automate as much of the process side of that as possible by creating tasks and approvals, but also by looking at data in order to understand, have we done what's necessary to move from one phase of the release to the next, so that we can ultimately answer the question, are we ready to release? So we are working on automating the validation of release readiness. So when we have data, that's what we like to use. We can always fall back to manual tasks and manual approvals. And we also have a guided adoption journey that we will have links to toward the end. So as you get started, this is not something, and actually our demo is going to be going over this. This is not something where you need to dive in day one and have everything fully automated, where you have all of your tools connected and we're looking at data and there's no manual process whatsoever. That is what we call our advanced automation end on the very right-hand side. But we can really start with streamlining just how we track our releases and how we help to provide visibility into the change management process as to what went on in the release itself. So we can get started with just what is our process, and then help you mature into things like connecting tools and automating the various parts of your release process, whether that's connecting to your development tools or connecting to other tools that are needed in order to make sure that we are ready to release. But this is not something where day one you have to have a completely automated system in place. So I'm going to start with why we're here. Change can be hard. I've been with ServiceNow for 10 and a half years. And the process of how we manage changes has just gotten harder. We have more types of software and hardware and services that we're managing. And as we're doing that, the original, let's say, ITIL change types that when I got started, there were just standard, normal, emergency. There weren't change models yet. These worked 10, 15, 20 years ago. But things have gotten more and more complex. And now, especially the normal change workflow, it has to be available for so many different types of changes that are going through that process. Um, and with DPR, what we were noticing from our customers is that release was getting bundled into change, making it even that much harder. So we started working on how do we, automate this change process. So about 5 years ago, I started working on DevOps change, which DevOps change was saying, okay, we have data that exists in the development tool chains, and we want to use that to automate the authorization of these changes. Because again, now we have data. Why have manual items that are being used and going through change and having our approval policies? So let's automate it. And that took advantage of a new concept that the DevOps change worked with change management to implement, which was change approval policies. So how do we leverage data that resides in ServiceNow to come to an outcome as to what we want to do? So this could be looking at anything that comes into ServiceNow. But with DevOps change, we look at things like, is there enough code coverage from our test results? Are there security scans? What's the status of our stories? What's the status of the test cases themselves? And also looking at things like, do we have error budget? Or are there conflicts with other changes? Is this a high impact system that we're updating, or a high risk system that we're updating? And based on that criteria, we could either say, let's just approve the change because the data says that we're good. Why send it to a person or send it to cab when we know through empirical data that we can move forward? Or we can just outright reject the change if it doesn't meet our criteria. Or we could send it to a manual review, whether that's a person or whether that is going to a cab. Let's use approval policies to route this. And that worked very well. But one of the next questions that we'd get asked with DevOps change is, that's great. How can we move that earlier? Because a change request tends to be validated or authorized toward the end of the process. So how do we know earlier whether or not that we're going to have a change that's ready to go out? And that's when we started working on digital product release. Because with digital product release, we started saying, how do we check policies early? So the same concept of a policy is now used to move from one phase of our release to the next. So we can have things like, do we have in the planning phase, do we have engineering alignment? Are all of the stories in a ready state for the development team to work on? Then we could have a build phase, and we could look at code coverage and code commits, and making sure that we have dev sign off before we go into release readiness testing and UAT and having our go no go decisions. We want to move the checks to make sure that we are ready as early in the process as we can. That way, we can simplify change management so that change management has access to this data, but doesn't need to have built into your change process all of the different ways that we could do a release. So as an example with ServiceNow, we have our family releases, which have one set of processes, one set of requirements. We have our store releases, we have our patch releases, and internally, we have other release processes. So because release is designed to have different kinds of releases, let's simplify where change can just say, is the release ready? Instead of saying, hey, we've got to have a different workflow for every different type of thing that we're going to release. So that is what digital product release is striving to do, and how we are going to leverage the concepts within change management to simplify change by adding release. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joe, who's going to go through a couple more items and then do some demos as to how you can, over a maturity curve, how you can start, how you can expand in maturity, and then how you can fully automate, which would be your end goal.
Thanks, Colin. All right, I will go ahead and take it from here. So, yeah, so one thing to understand is that the policies in release management are very different than in change management, right? So today, the problem that we see, a lot of customers have added policies and added even change tasks that are really associated with getting a new version of a product ready. Yeah. And that's something we have to do because for compliance reasons, we need to make sure that that actually took place before we allow a change to go into production. However, with release management, if it's fully intact, that uh, compliance check should be happening as part of the release process, right? So we do have a delineation of which types of policies we might use for release management and which types of policies we should use for change management. And when I talk about policies in change management, I'm specifically talking about the change approval policies. And for the most part, anything that's specific to the version of a product, such as the testing of the product, the unit testing, the functional testing, performance testing, any of the regression testing, that should be handled in the release process. You should have a phase in the release process. Maybe it's called testing, maybe it's called validation. And this is where that type of check would take place. You might also have security scans or quality scans that look at that, they do a static analysis of the code. That should take place during the release process. It's very important, before a version of a product goes into production, and the impact to production is where we make sure that all of this is actually done in a change record. However, this is specific to that version of the release. So what we can do in the change record is really simplify it, remove a lot of these policies that are specific to the version of a product, and focus on the impact to the production environment. Look at things like the stability of the environment. Are there any incidents or outages? Look at the business context of the application. What's the business criticality of the application? If it's, like a highly critical application and it's during a maintenance window, maybe we want to make sure that the somebody has a manual review of that change. Is it a regulated application? Does it have customer data in it? These are the kind of things we want to check off, during the change approval process, right? So there also might be approvers, service owners, business unit heads, and so on that need to approve the change, right? That should take place during the change process because you're impacting a running service, and so on. Business context such as geography, right? If different geographies have different requirements for a change, based on compliance and regulations in those geographies. Like, for example, GDPR might check that there's no customer data impacted by the change or exposed by the change and so on. So both of these processes require effective communication and also a continuous improvement process. So the feedback loop is very important. Okay. Now this brings me to just want to bring you to another aspect of this is changes that have taken place just in development methodologies over the past 10, 15 years or so, 20 years almost now, have led to just a different relationship between release management and change management. And you'll see this in the demo. The old traditional ITIL change management would have you record a change record even before you started the release process, right? Because the change was a big change and maybe you're releasing the product, the new version of the product once a quarter or every 8 weeks or so, and it's a much longer process. You would create a change, and then within that change record, you would have these tasks associated with it. Agile, and specifically if you're using DevOps and continuous delivery, now you're making small incremental changes, often continuously. So, every day or several times a day, you might make a small incremental change to production. That requires a change record still, but it's happening at the point of deployment. And you'll see in our DevOps change velocities, this is the problem we solve with that solution. We want to make sure changes are created right at the point of deployment. But both processes need to work together, right? And the sequence of events is often different in the traditional ITIL process and in the more modern way of doing continuous delivery and continuous deployment. You're going to end up with a lot more changes. When you attach your pipelines to change management, for example, you're going to end up with, more changes, smaller changes, more incremental changes, uh, but you're going to end up with a lot more. And in order not to overload the change managers, right, we need that automation. We need those change policies in place. And this is why I think this kind of led to this problem we have that we're solving with digital product release, where we overloaded the change process with those policies. Okay. So automating is very important, and also using tools to sort of observe uh, the impact of those changes. So observability becomes very important. You roll out new changes. Does it impact performance? Does it impact the user experience? That has to be part of that feedback loop as well. Okay. I'm going to jump into the demo, but first, I see we do have some questions. So I don't know if you can come off mute, or if you want to put your question in the Q&A, we can do that.
So far, Joe, I've answered most that have gone in the Q&A. One question that did come up that we're going to be handling anyways, but just be aware of, is how we work together with DevOps change.
Good question. And yes, we will cover that in the demonstration. So hold on to that. Yep. Were there any other questions? All right. If
I think
not,
we're good for now.
great. We do have a couple of poll questions. So we have some questions for you. And let me see if I can go ahead and launch that poll question. Okay. So our first question is regarding the overloaded change process that we discussed. So is your change process overloaded with policies today? All right, and the answers are coming in fast and furious. I see we already have over 150 responses.
It looks pretty evenly spread right now, but that means 2/3 to some extent have an
Yeah,
overloaded process today.
right, right. Okay, let's share these results. And yeah, as you can see, it's really evenly distributed there. Yeah. Yep. Okay, we have another question here. And our next question is regarding change models. So Colin mentioned change models. This is relatively new capability, and we want to understand if you've been taking advantage of these change models to simplify the change, the phases of a change, the transitions between the different phases of a change, to simplify the way the fields that are available in the change, and so on. Okay.
And so while that's coming in, there was a question that came in about CMDB maturity in order to use DPR. So I'll answer that real quick as we go into the demo. It's not necessary to have a mature CMDB to get started. We did design DPR to help you to start along the maturity path with the CMDB. So behind the scenes, we use product models, and this is futures, but we're adding more connections to CIs so that we can help you get to having a mature CMDB, because that is a goal of ours, but it's not required to get started. Now, obviously, the more mature your CMDB is, the more automations you can put in place. For instance, if you need to have an approval, if it's like a high impact CI, so you've got a critical system, if you have a CMDB that knows about it, then you can route based on that. But if you have a CMDB and it doesn't know about like critical systems, then you can't. So it's not necessary to get started, but we definitely help you down that journey. And the more mature it is, the more automations you can put in place.
Thanks, Colin. And then once again, I'm going to share the results here. We see a pretty good, a pretty even distribution, exactly 42 to 42, even down to the individual numbers of respondents that say yes or not yet, but we plan to. And then about 15% so far have no plans to use change models. All right, so I think that's it for the polling. And now on to the demonstration. That's the part that everybody's waiting for. Okay, so we're gonna show you how to connect change to release and how we can raise changes through DPR, and then also how we automate changes with change velocity. In fact, I think what I want to do is start with a little bit of a recap of change velocity, just so everybody understands this is a capability, because basically this was the original way we solved this problem way back when, in that even though the change process was overloaded, we figured we can create these changes in an automated way and then apply policies in an automated way. So before we decided, you know what, let's move these policies into digital product release, this is very much, even though it's an automated change, it's very much an example of an overloaded change process, meaning at the point of deployment, right? And just to take you back a minute, if you look at the pipeline that we're tracking, you know, we're building an application, we're running tests of the application, we go through some UAT and some staging and so on. And then right before we deploy the application, this is just your typical pipeline. That's when we open the change record, right? So the change record is saying we're going to deploy this version of this application, and we track the version as artifacts coming through the build process. We're going to track this version of this application against these configuration items. This was just the way we solved this problem. Oh, 5 years ago now, we created this solution, right, to solve this problem. And what we did was we took all the data points that were necessary and we added them to the change record, including data from the commits, data from the work items, test summaries, and so on, all the test results, quality scans, security scans, all of that. And then that made its way into a change approval policy. So this is a change approval policy with all the overloaded policies baked into it, where we can say, hey, based on these 16 inputs, let's come up with a decision. If it's high risk, we'll reject the change. If all the policies are met, we can approve the change, right? And the policy acceptance criteria would look something like this. And we can see the conditions and the criteria that's required to get that automated approval. And most of the time, 85, 90% of the time, you know, we would get to this automated approval. And if we couldn't either automatically approve or reject the change, it would get escalated for a manual review. And then this change would just follow almost a normal change process, except that it had all the information. So this was great. It gave the compliance folks all the data they needed in the change record. It took a lot of pressure. The automation took a lot of pressure off of the change managers, so they didn't have to approve every single change. And you know, customers didn't have to use things like standard changes, which really wasn't appropriate for application code changes. Okay, so now fast forward. You know, last year we released digital product release, and I'll take you through that. I'll show you how now a lot of that complexity that you see in the change process can be mitigated by doing things in the release process. So first thing I'm going to show you is it's just what a release looks like in digital products release. So you're going to have phases of a release. You're going to have in each phase, tasks, and then also policies in each phase. And what does that look like? So this is a high-level view of the overall status of a release. We see it started, 100 days ago, and that included like the planning and design phases. I'll show you what that looks like here. The development phase and also user acceptance validation. All of that's happening before we actually get ready to deploy. So the deployment is coming up on 4/28, you see here. And for each phase, we have tasks, and we can see the status of those tasks. This is like a Kanban board. And very important, we have policies, okay? So what you saw in a change policy, and I'm going to switch back to this change record here, you see we're looking at things like development best practices, and we're looking at the results of the test passing. What we want to do is to simplify this change, is move that into the release process. So instead of it being here, we're going to have policies here that show things like code coverage, right? Because what these policies reflect is not the actual deployment to production and getting it ready for that, but actually getting this version of this product ready to be released. Not all products get released, right? Not all versions of products get released. Sometimes you might skip a version, but you still build it and you still go through the process of creating it for for eventual deployment, right? When you do deploy, we have to make sure all these things are compliant, but that takes place during the phases of the release. So you see various phases and various states of compliance. I just want to point out one specific one here, that the software quality compliant is not compliant. So this is directly attached to the latest version of this product. Okay, what does that mean? So today, when we develop code and applications in a modern way, we're often creating builds almost every day. Okay, every day, the development team checks in their code and builds get created. In digital product release, we can track that latest version. You can put a specific version in here if that's the one you want to reflect in the status of the release. But here, we actually see every single build that comes through, and we're going to track that in digital product release and make that and reflect that the status of that as quality of that build in these dashboards here. Okay, so what you'll see is an evolving release of a product that is moving closer and closer to compliance with these requirements, right? Now, this particular version we're showing as non-compliant. I created a new build, okay? And you can see these builds are happening. This is now, I switched over to GitHub. This is where the development effort takes place. One thing to keep in mind is we collect all this data in a passive way, meaning we don't expect developers to log into ServiceNow and provide this data. As I'm building and updating and committing code, all that data is flowing in real time into ServiceNow so that we can track it, right? And that's important because it's very important that for developer productivity that they stay in their tools, okay? So as you see, this latest build, number 243, it reflects here as a failed test. Within ServiceNow, we see that as a policy showing up as non-compliant, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and build another one. This time, I'm going to make sure that those tests pass. And we're going to build number, looks like build 244. Okay, so 244 will kick off. Each one of these takes 1 or 2 minutes to build. And then at some point, I'll go ahead and deploy that to production. And that's the point where I need a change record, right? Because we're tracking the readiness of a release in DPR and all the tasks associated with it, all of the tests associated with it. But now, if I'm going to deploy one of those builds, I'm going to need a change record. And what is the change record really doing? It's taking the build, specifically the build, and the configuration item that I'm deploying to, and saying, hey, this change is impacting this configuration item. I'm deploying this version of this product to this configuration item. This is basically the link. And if you want to talk about the common services data model, this is the link between the build and design part of the common services data model, where we have business applications, and we have the products live, and the different software models and the application model and so on. That's all happening in DPR. But at some point, I'm going to say, hey, this build is now ready for deployment to production. I need a change record. And you can see we have several change records for this release, right? So this is one of the big distinctions in the new way we're doing things, is that we are creating changes every time we deploy one. And you might have noticed that some of these environments are not production environments. They're UAT environments, and they show up as a test environment, right? More and more of our customers are in order to track what version of which product is in which environment, they create change records for those non-prod environments. So more and more of our customers want change records for sub-prod. Do we have to have tight controls on it? Maybe not. Maybe these changes are what we call just change receipts, basically record keeping of a change that took place in environment without all of the approval policies, right? We just create the change, it gets automatically closed, but now we have a record that this version of this product is installed in this environment, okay? So now, let's go back to our build. I see build 244. I'm gonna go ahead and deploy this to an environment here. I see there's another deployment running. Maybe I'll go ahead and cancel that, just so this one will run a little faster. I'm going to run 5.0.244 was my latest build, okay? So that's the new version of this product. I'm deploying it to production. This workflow here in GitHub Actions and is going to utilize DevOps change velocity to automatically create that change record, okay? So you saw that we have pipeline, and we track these pipelines and so on. These pipelines could be in Jenkins, they could be in ADO, they can be in, like you see here, GitHub Actions and so on. We are deploying a change. And now if we go back to digital product release, at some point we should create a new change record. Now here, this is also very important. These change records can take advantage of a simpler change model, okay? So what do I mean by that? Let's say you have a change model specifically for software releases, and that's what we just created here for this demonstration. So a normal change model might have, and I'll take you into it, might have a bunch of different states that you have to go through that include, humans actually assessing the conditions of the change and the attributes of the change and the different data. We can remove that, right? We're going to do this in an automated way. We don't need all of these different states because of the automation. So we can simplify that change process. And that's exactly what we do. If we look at a software release, we no longer have that assess stage. So that's one way we've simplified it. The other thing we do is we create very simple transitions between the states. This is what the change models allow you to do. To create these simple transitions that allow you to go from one state to the next, based on certain criteria and so on. So this is the value of change models, and we're going to implement this change model specifically for this pipeline, okay? So as this is running, we should get a new change, and I'm just going to drill into this. Very important. This is the view that the application development team sees, right? What we do here, and that's very valuable, and this one is still loading. I'll show you the previous one. What we do here is when these changes are deployed, we actually include in the console of the pipeline, which is essentially the development team's system of record, right? This is the system of record that developers use. We include the status of the changes. The developers don't have to call up anybody and find out, hey, what's the status of my change? We're updating the console so they can see it. It's very transparent, and it's really just showing that we're respecting this as the system of record for the development side and for the deployment side to production, okay? All this activity does get registered in the change record as well, because on the operation side, we have our own system of record, right? Right, so back here in, let's see, back to digital product release here, I'm gonna go to, how did I end up with, oh, there we go. All right, so here's our new change record that was created for 244. And as I will show you, it gets created with, lots of information about the change, including all the commits associated with. So these are the Git commits. We automatically create the work items, link the work items to the change. Very important, because we're tracking these things against, the release itself, right? One of the things we do in digital product release is we track the scope of what's included in that release. And when they're completed, when they're actually deployed, and if we look at the release scope, they are represented here as well. But when they're actually, like that one here, that language support for reports is marked complete, because that change deployed it to production. And the release is not complete until all the stories are complete, right? And all the stories are deployed. So that's really what we're tracking in digital product releases. We're making sure everything is completed. The other thing about that change record is that we are using the simplified software release change model. So you'll see that, we have fewer phases to go through. Okay. Any questions? How are we doing, Colin?
Yeah, so far there have been a whole bunch that I've been answering. Let me bring up, because there are a couple that that are around like the CMDB, which
Uh-huh.
I think you've answered. But a core thing to keep in mind is that like DPR is working on what it is that you are planning to deploy. So, for instance, that version Winter 5.0 is the version that's going to be deployed, and we leave it, as you were just saying about, we leave the change request to actually represent the configuration item of where we are deploying it to. So as you're looking at different, like there's a question about cloud CIs and how they're represented. Those are all, I'd say, standard part of ServiceNow and what CIs you would use. We're saying version 5.0 is what we are validating, and it's going to be deployed to, leveraging change, this particular CI, which could be an application service, or maybe it could be like particular server that you want to denote. And we pull the information about like which environment it is from those CI records. So Joe, if you click on the change requests tab real quick, that where it says like environment, that is actually looking at the environment field of the configuration item to know what environment we're talking about there, because that's managed by your configuration items themselves. If you don't manage that level, then it'll just be empty. But that is how we're pulling that particular information. And let me see if there were so there are a couple more questions that I'll answer in chat. But let's also make sure to go over like, you can just start with creating a change. So while we have the ability to, connect all of this, and there are lots of questions, by the way, around, how code builds are coordinated and things like that. If you're not to that point, we do start with, we can just click the new button to add visibility to between change and release.
Yeah, so this is a manually created change. I can manually fill in what configuration item I'm deploying to. And I can, the software model is automatically filled in, right? The software model is what links the change to the version of the product. So if you're manually creating the changes, that's going to work exactly the same way. And then that will show up on the list as well. If we go back to here and look at that change. There's my manually created change, linked to the same CI. And so, automatic changes are nice to have. DevOps change velocity will provide that, but it's not required. If you still want to create manual changes, that's absolutely fine.
So one other question that came up, and I'm going to answer it mostly because it's about code and how you have multiple maybe applications being developed simultaneously that all work together. So I'll answer most of the code stuff in the webinar Q&A, but there is a question about like, what if you do have something that's more complicated, where you've got a product that is comprised of multiple kind of child products, child software. So Joe, could you go into the products page? And I think your FMR loan has 2 included products in it.
It does indeed. There's actually some other examples that have even nested included products. This
Yeah.
is
So
FMR loans. Yeah.
we can model if you need it. We can model a complex. I think Smart Shopper, yeah, has a nested. We can model out how this product is kind of decomposed into smaller, maybe microservices. They can even reference each other, so they don't have to be in a strict like hierarchy if they're necessary to kind of bundle together. So you can create more complex, but this is a key thing if it's necessary. If you have an application and you don't need to kind of decompose it into smaller portions, then you don't have to. And then with the releases themselves, we've been using a simpler single product release, but you can have a release that is comprised of smaller, like, so it has, it's writing Smart Shopper here. It will pull in the children to make a more complex multi-product release.
And you could remove some of them, right? You don't have to have them
Yeah,
all as part of the release. You might just be releasing, a couple of components in this iteration. And you can even
right.
add something that's not part of the hierarchy, right? I could say, hey, you know what? We're going to have the invoice tracker added to this release because even though it's not part of that product model, it's still part of this release. And then we're going to have, a different version of that available, right?
Yeah. I had an example from a customer early on where they're like their healthcare customer, like we're doing Epic, but sometimes Zoom also goes in the same release. Totally
Mhm.
not related to each other, but they'd be able to add Zoom as another product that's in this release.
All right, those are
Okay,
good.
and while I was answering that, a bunch more questions came in. So
Questions
uh,
will also always yield more questions. Yeah.
yep. So there is their latest copy of the CSDM and IT for IT. Version 5 is imminent of the Common Services Data Model. It is being officially released with knowledge, and we are a part of it. Not just DPR, but also DevOps, the DevOps Data Model. So there are updates, and there is a separate recording on our community site, which I will post a link. I put it in one of the answers, but I'll post a link to it in chat as well. That our community site has a 1-hour session on DPR and the Common Services Data Model. So if you want to have an in-depth session on that topic, there is collateral that we have created for it because again, we're not, you don't have to be very mature in this at all. We're going to help you. The records that even Joe is interacting with, our product record is a CSDM record. We just give it a name that makes a little more sense than application model or software model. We use common terms like product and version, but we are putting records in the right place to help you to adopt the Common Services Data Model gently. So you don't have to do a full kind of implementation of it. So yes, there is definitely information there that we can help. And I'll be again posting a link to our community site in the chat in just a few minutes.
Great. Okay, we do have a few more slides here. We did cover manual changes, so I'm gonna move on. Um, Semi-automated change model. Colin, did you want to go through the remaining slides here and just wrap up?
Yeah, certainly. So with the semi-automated, we kind of did all of these together in the demo, but as we started, Joe was just showing I can create a change request. But as we start adopting change models, actually, Joe, can you share your screen and go to that change policy? So when you create, a change model, we made one that was just a simplified. We have we have change models. Um, but yeah, if this goes to the list of actually, Joe,
Legal.
go
Go into
in
change
not
models.
this
Yeah.
one. Yeah, no, go into change policies.
Oh, change policies. Got it. Yep.
And it's change approval policies. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, go to that one. So we also have an example where we're wanting to, before we get to the full DevOps one, click on the software release policies, the last one in that list. We can also define something where we're just looking at the change request or the release itself. So click on decisions for me, Joe, on this last one, and then the compliant release. So because we have policies in DPR, we can actually just look at the phase that of the release that we're in and check to make sure that the status of it is compliant, or in this case, compliant with exceptions. If you're also using our integrated risk management from ServiceNow, because at that point we've introduced the ability to start simplifying your change process while relying on DPR to be the is what we're deploying ready. So in this example, we're saying if the status of the release basically is compliant, then we can just auto approve in this
Yeah. So
case.
you're taking
Or
6 or 7 line items that I showed
right,
before, and because we shifted that all into the release process, we could replace that with just one saying, the release phase policy status is compliant, and that covers everything on that list.
yeah, exactly. So that means you can rely on a single kind of model that says it's aware of release instead of having to build different models for different kinds of things that are going to go through your release process. So again, just on simplifying. And then if this isn't right, if you go back one, the other decision, Joe, um, then in this case, the default is it didn't meet the approval. So it has some non-compliant policies. Therefore, we
Got to
go to
go to
cab.
cab. Got to
That's
go
where we're
to
going to route
cab.
it to.
Yeah.
So you can use this to start down that journey, and then eventually get you into that full DevOps CI/CD side where we've got a completely automated release and change process.
Awesome. Right. So that
Okay,
covers
so
change. Yeah.
so the last thing that I wanted to cover, and then I'm going to look through to see if there are any other Q&A items. You can keep moving, Joe, to
Yep. We covered the
keep
fully
going.
automated. Yep.
Yep. And then finally, one more slide. Talk a little bit about the future. So I said at the very beginning um, that we have a little bit of future items that we're talking about. So we're now to the future. Everything Joe
Back to the
showed
future.
is available today, so you don't have to wait on what Joe has covered. But we've been getting feedback from customers on, we are creating changes from release, and that's great. But what about when we have complex releases? So whether it's what I'll call the patching use case, so we need to patch 1,000 Windows servers or 10,000 Windows servers. How do we manage that process? Like, what should a change look like? As well as the what I'll call the multi-product use case, which is I have, let's say that Smart Shopper, and all of those child products were microservices, and they all need to go out together. So how do we handle that? And today, most customers create, like for the patching use case, one change request and load in 1,000 or 10,000 affected CIs. What we're moving towards, and this is going to be over several releases to DPR and working in conjunction with the change management team, because they're peers, we have the same boss. And so we're working on this together, is how can we make it feel like you have one change request, but in fact, you have one change request per CI. So if you need to have different scheduling for some of the services that are going to be impacted, so 10 of our 10,000 Windows servers need to go at a different date than the other, 9,990. If we don't have a change request for each CI, we can't do that. What if two of those Windows servers are touching, or basically the infrastructure for impactful services that maybe you can't deploy to right now? Maybe we're in a blackout window for some of them, but not others. If we don't have multiple change requests, then we can't manage them independently. However, for the other 9,000 plus change requests, you don't want to manage those independently. No one does. They need to be there, but you need to manage them as if they're one consolidated thing. Or in a multi-product, I have 50 microservices. I don't want to manage even 50 change requests. I want it to feel like one, but get the benefit of scheduling and conflict detection for each of them independently. So we are now actively working on, we're in planning right now, sizing. This is going to, again, go out over multiple releases to DPR. But how do we handle, go ahead and move one more slide, Joe. How do we handle the planning? How do we kind of group these into either waves or environments? How do we sequence them? What about dependencies? How do we automate the creation, making sure that fields are filled out properly, making sure we're moving through state transitions? And how do we authorize them? But again, who wants to click authorize 9,000 times? Probably nobody on this call. Definitely not me. So we are working on how we manage these more complex rollouts. The term rollout is what we're using internally. I might call it something different as the official name, but how do we manage lots of change requests for complex releases? So that is actively going on. If that's something that is interesting, that you'd like to learn more about it, then I definitely reach out to myself. And that way you will be able to connect. I'd love to hear feedback. I've been interviewing customers, but if this is a problem that resonates, then definitely reach out, and we'd love to interview and learn more about what you're doing today, the problems that you're running into with the current one. If you've made a custom solution, which a lot of customers have, what does that look like? I'd love to learn more. So it's kind of a plug for me to learn more about what you're doing and what problems you're having.
Yeah, and based on the comments in the chat, there's a lot of interest in this and a lot of excitement about it.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, again, please reach out. And I'm going to put two things in the chat. So the first one right now is a link to our community site, and the other is my email address, so that you can email if this is something that you'd like to connect and learn more on, or if you put something in the chat, we do get a list of the chat items as well, and we'll go through that list and reach out to you as well. So in the last 5 minutes, DPR, I've put a link to the community site that we have. We also do have a playbook on prescriptive guidance on how to get ready. We are more of a turnkey solution. So to get started does not typically need a full implementation. And in fact, for our numbers of adoption in Q1, I think about 90% of the customers that went live in Q1 did so without help from us or anyone else. Because again, for getting started, we're more of a turnkey solution to get going. So we have a lot of content on the community site on guidance on how to do it. And we also post these videos. So long as there's nothing blocking it, this video will also get posted to our community site. The community site has a post for when I did a video on this and the common services data model. So lots of content out there, and we're going to be revamping it as we had pretty major release in February. and we've got more coming in uh, in May. So with that, let me check to see, because we have just a few more minutes, if there's any other last questions that we want to answer live. Let's see. So I see if there's a release related to a product that is integrated with other systems, how does it impact them? This just this question I want to answer real quickly, and then there's one other one. So DPR, we've been out for a little over a year, and we have lots of things we're still working on. One of them is on dependency management between them. So if it's all a release that can be worked together, so like the Smart Shopper example, then you would be able to know if they all have to move together. So if one of the microservices is blocked, then the release won't continue. But we do have another scenario that we don't support yet, which is, what if it's just dependent on a release in a totally different part of the organization? So we will be solving that in the future, but I don't have an out of box today where they're just all contained within the release. So just again, futures, that is a use case that we are going to be supporting more broadly than how we do it today. And the other one, if we manage integrated environments, that have different products in each of their own versions, that is also, if I understand the question correctly, something that will be a part of the future where we have these rollout plans, because we're going to be connecting CIs or configuration items directly to releases and to the release phases. So if you have different environments, you'll be able to specify them. And we also have items for how to help you in connecting the dots on CI relationships to say, like, this environment is dependent on some other environment that's also coming. But in August, again, we're still sizing, so I can't say it's definitely committed, but we do plan to connect the configuration items to the phases of a release to help with that rollout plan initiative that we have. Okay, so we've got just as we
There's
wrap up.
one last question. Just
one last question.
Yeah. How are we going to manage plan window and CTest function in the DevOps model? So change tasks and well, that's all accounted for in change management, right? We don't manage that in DPR. When you're deploying something to an environment and you create a change record, that's a subset of the change management, and that doesn't change basically the way it works today, right?
Yeah, and with DevOps, like, you can specify when creating the change in DevOps what your change window is. So that way it's just a part of the change that gets automatically created.
Yeah.
Now, if
And
it's in a blackout period,
automated callback doesn't kick in until it reaches the
right?
implementation phase, which only happens when there's like a maintenance window. It'll wait for that phase to open, or if there's a blackout period,
Right.
or there's some kind of other conflict. And the implementation phase is the key to the callback to the pipeline.
Okay.
I think we're done.
So again, thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, everyone. There have been lots of questions. I was hurriedly typing through most of Joe's demo. So thank you all again for joining. Please reach out if you have more questions. If you want to learn more on our community site, again, has a lot of information, but definitely if you want to learn more, happy to assist.
Hey, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.